Welcome to our channel. Today we're diving into the fascinating world of the Middle Ages to debunk some common misconceptions. When we think about the Middle Ages, often our minds conjure images of knights in shining armor, damsels in distress, and maybe even a plague or two. But how much of what we think we know about this period is actually true? Turns out, a lot of what we know about the Middle Ages is based on stereotypes and myths that have been perpetuated over centuries. So, buckle up, history buffs and curious minds, as we separate fact from fiction and uncover the truth about this often misunderstood era. Let's get this one out of the way. People in the Middle Ages did not believe the Earth was flat. The ancient Greeks knew the Earth was a sphere, and this knowledge was preserved. Scholars like Roger Bacon and Bede discuss the Earth's spherical nature. People weren't falling off the edge of the world. Sure, peasants made up a large part of the medieval population, but to say everyone was a peasant is like saying everyone today is a YouTuber. Medieval society was actually quite structured. You had your kings and queens at the top, then nobles, knights, clergy, merchants, artisans, and yes, peasants and serfs. Each group had its own role to play, and there was even some social mobility. We've all seen the movies, the valiant knight, clad in shining armor, rescuing damsels and upholding justice. While knights were real, their lives were far less glamorous and far more brutal than Hollywood portrays. Chivalry, as a code of conduct, did exist, but it was often more aspirational than realistic. Knights were warriors, and warfare in the Middle Ages was a messy business. It's easy to think of the Middle Ages as a scientific dark age, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The medieval period saw significant advancements in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Hildegard von Bingen, a polymath and philosopher, pushed the boundaries of scientific knowledge. Universities emerged, translating and preserving ancient texts, laying the foundation for the Renaissance. The average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was lower, but that doesn't mean everyone died at 30. High infant and child mortality rates brought the average down. Surviving childhood meant a chance to live into your 60s or 70s. They faced plagues and famine, but had effective herbal remedies. It wasn't all leeches and bloodletting. The church often gets a bad rap for suppressing knowledge during the Middle Ages, but let's set the record straight. While there were conflicts between religious and scientific thought, the church was a major patron of learning. Monasteries preserved ancient texts and made copies of books. Without the church, much ancient knowledge would have been lost. Here's a misconception that really stinks. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people were not filthy creatures who never bathed. Public bathhouses were common, and people bathed regularly, often using herbs and fragrances in their bath water. Sure, they didn't have modern plumbing and sanitation, but they weren't exactly living in filth. The Black Death was devastating, no doubt about it. But it wasn't the only plague to afflict medieval Europe. Outbreaks of diseases like smallpox, leprosy, and dysentery were a recurring problem, often leading to widespread death and social disruption. The experience of living through these pandemics had a profound impact on medieval society, shaping everything from art and literature to religious beliefs and even fashion. Castles might seem romantic and impressive from the outside, but life inside those stone walls was often cold, damp, and not very comfortable. Forget about central heating, indoor plumbing, or even glass windows in many cases. While castles provided protection during sieges, they were also drafty, dark, and prone to infestations. Not exactly the luxurious palaces you see in the movies, huh? The image of witches being burned at the stake is often linked to the Middle Ages, but large-scale witch hunts gained momentum in the 16th and 17th centuries. While there were accusations of witchcraft in the Middle Ages, systematic persecution was largely absent. This highlights how our perception of history is shaped by later events. Okay, so maybe leeches and prayers were involved, but medieval medicine was more sophisticated than just bloodletting and hoping for the best. Medieval physicians had a surprisingly good understanding of anatomy and were skilled surgeons, even performing complex procedures like cataract surgery. They also relied heavily on herbal remedies, many of which have proven to be effective. Let's just debunk this myth right now. Vikings did not wear horned helmets. Actual Viking helmets were made of leather or metal, and they were designed for practicality, not fashion. The horned helmet myth is a great example of how popular culture can distort our understanding of history. The Middle Ages. It's complicated and long. Spanning roughly 1,000 years, the Middle Ages can't be lumped into one entity. It was a time of immense change, marked by intellectual and artistic flourishing, as well as war, famine, and upheaval. To understand it, we must appreciate its complexity and diversity. While serfs were tied to the land and obligated to work for their lord, they were not slaves. They had certain rights, like cultivating their own land, and couldn't be bought or sold. It was mutual obligation. The lord provided protection, and the serfs provided labor. It's important to understand the distinctions between serfdom and slavery. Medieval art wasn't about realism. It was about symbolism and spirituality. The skill and craftsmanship in illuminated manuscripts, cathedrals, and tapestries are incredible. Look at the stained glass windows of Chartres or the Book of Kells. That's art. Forget the image of gruel and stale bread. Peasant food was simpler than noble feasts, but medieval cuisine was diverse and flavorful. They ate various fruits, vegetables, meats, and spices, using elaborate recipes and techniques. So, while you might not trade your pizza for a medieval meat pie, they weren't just gnawing on bones. While women in the Middle Ages certainly faced limitations due to patriarchal social structures, their lives were far from powerless or insignificant. Women ran businesses, managed estates, worked as artisans, and played important roles in religious life. The lives of women in the Middle Ages were diverse and often challenging, but they were far from simply being silent and subservient. Contrary to the image of a static and isolated world, the Middle Ages were a time of significant cultural exchange. Trade routes like the Silk Road connected Europe to Asia, bringing goods, ideas, and even diseases. Pilgrimages, crusades, and diplomatic missions facilitated the movement of people and knowledge. The medieval world was more interconnected than we often give it credit for. While the term Inquisition might conjure up images of medieval torture chambers, the Inquisition was largely a phenomenon of the early modern period, specifically the 15th century and beyond. While the Church addressed heresy during the Middle Ages, the Inquisition's methods were more widespread in later centuries. It's crucial to place events in their proper chronological context. While literacy rates were lower than today, medieval people were not uneducated. Education was valued, with schooling through monasteries and cathedral schools. Besides religious instruction, students learned grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. The medieval period laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and later educational advancements we benefit from today. So, there you have it. 20 misconceptions about the Middle Ages. Busted. Hopefully, this video has challenged some of your preconceived notions and given you a new appreciation for this fascinating period. The Middle Ages weren't perfect, but they were far from the dark ages they're often portrayed to be. They were a time of innovation, creativity, and hygiene. Don't believe everything you hear. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more historical debunking.